Hey everyone, welcome back. We had a ton of requests to do a deep dive into the story of Mary Surratt and her connection to the Lincoln assassination.
Definitely a story shrouded in mystery and controversy.
Yeah, and to help us unravel it, we've got a couple of fascinating sources.
First up, we got this really cool podcast episode.
It kind of puts you, the listener, right in the middle of 1865 Washington, D.C., just a week after Mary Surratt's execution.
Talk about a tense atmosphere. Public opinion is all over the place, and even close friends are turning on each other.
And then we'll also be drawing from an interview with historian Clifford Larson.
She's the author of The Assassin's Accomplice, so she really dug deep into this story.
Okay, so picture this. You're in 1865 D.C., just been evicted from Mary Surratt's boarding house, and you're desperately trying to find a new place to live.
Not an easy task, I'd imagine, with all the suspicion swirling around anyone connected to the Surratts.
Right, and as you're walking down the street, you bump into an old friend, and they just lay into you, accusing you of lying at the trial to save your own skin.
Oof, that's gotta sting. It really puts you in the shoes of someone living through this historical moment and grappling with the weight of this trial and its aftermath.
It wasn't just about Mary Surratt. It fractured relationships and left the community reeling. It makes you wonder, was she truly guilty?
And if so, how did this seemingly ordinary woman get caught up in such a monumental event?
Well, that's where Clifford Larson comes in. Now, get this. She actually started her research aiming to prove Mary Surratt innocent.
Seriously, that's a pretty big twist.
Yes. But as she delved deeper into primary sources, interrogation records, trial transcripts, eyewitness accounts, her perspective started to shift.
The power of primary sources, right? They can really challenge our assumptions.
Absolutely. So to understand how Mary Surratt ended up in the middle of this conspiracy, let's back up a bit and get a sense of her life before all this.
Okay, set the stage for us.
Mary Surratt was born in the early 1820s in Maryland to a middle-class slave-owning family. Went to a Catholic boarding school and eventually became a devout Catholic.
So a pretty typical upbringing for a woman of her time and status.
In some ways, yes. But then she married John Surratt, and, well, he was a bit of a rogue.
Oh, red flags.
You could say that. A gambler, heavy drinker, not exactly the most reliable husband, according to the sources.
So already some drama in her life before the war even begins.
Definitely. Then after her husband dies, she's left to manage family properties and businesses, including a tavern, during the chaos of the Civil War.
Talk about a tough hand to be dealt.
And keep in mind, she's in southern Maryland, a hotbed of Confederate activity, facing financial struggles and the constant threat of Union confiscation.
Caught between a rock and a hard place for sure. So how does John Wilkes Booth, the infamous assassin, come into the picture? Was it just a random encounter?
The connection is through Mary's son, John Surratt Jr. He was a Confederate spy operating in the area.
Ah, so the family already has ties to the Confederacy.
Yes, and that's how John Jr. introduces Booth to the family. Now, Booth at this point is furious with Lincoln, enraged by his policies and how the war is progressing.
Makes sense. He was a staunch Confederate sympathizer.
Right, and his initial plan was actually to kidnap Lincoln and use him as leverage to get Confederate prisoners released.
Kidnap the president. Wow. That's a pretty bold move.
It was a desperate, daring scheme fueled by a fervent belief in the Confederate cause.
But as we all know, that plan eventually morphed into something far more sinister. So here we have Mary Surratt, a widowed mother trying to navigate a war-torn world and now entangled with this brewing conspiracy.
It really begs the question, was she just an unwitting pawn, or did she play a more active role in Booth's plans?
Right, was she complicit or just caught in a web she didn't weave?
And that's exactly what Clifford Larson set out to answer. What she uncovered was a much deeper and more complex relationship between Mary Surratt and John Wilkes Booth than initially meets the eye.
Okay, so more than just a landlady renting him a room.
Much more. Booth found a sense of refuge in her boarding house in Washington, D.C. It was a place where he could move freely and plan his operations.
A safe haven in the heart of enemy territory.
Exactly. And they had private meetings, and Mary, with her Southern sympathies, might have seen him as a potential protector for her family.
So a connection forged through a shared cause and maybe even a sense of desperation in a world consumed by war. But what was it that ultimately convinced Larson that Mary Surratt was Betsy? Did she find a smoking gun, so to speak?
Well, there wasn't one single piece of irrefutable evidence. It was more like a convergence of factors that she pieced together from interrogation records and trial transcripts.
So like a puzzle with different pieces coming together to form a picture.
Exactly. And what those pieces suggest is that while Mary Surratt was involved in the initial plot to kidnap Lincoln, her actions in the days leading up to the assassination went beyond just providing a meeting place.
What kind of actions? Fill us in.
Well, there's evidence that she relayed messages, possibly helped transport weapons for Booth's escape, and might have even been aware of his plan to assassinate Lincoln.
Wow, that's a lot more involvement than just being a sympathetic landlady.
Right. And it was this pattern of choices, this active involvement in aiding Booth, that convinced Larson of her culpability. It wasn't just association, it was a deliberate series of actions that pointed to a deeper role in the conspiracy.
It's fascinating that even during her trial, Mary Surratt made a very deliberate choice about her appearance, choosing to wear a black veil throughout the proceedings.
That's a great observation. It really speaks to the power of image, even back then.
Right. So was it a genuine expression of grief, or was there something more calculated going on?
It's hard to say for sure, but Larson suggests it was likely a bit of both. By presenting herself as this pious, grieving widow, she was playing to the sympathies of both the courtroom audience and the wider public.
So almost like an early PR strategy shaping the public's perception of her.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Larson thinks it might have backfired. The veil, while intended to evoke sympathy, also created a barrier.
How so?
People couldn't see her face, couldn't connect with her emotionally. Some even went as far as to speculate that she was hiding a criminal face under the veil.
Wow. Talk about judging a book by its cover, or in this case, by the lack of one.
It's a striking example of how societal expectations around femininity, piety, and even guilt played a role in such a serious legal matter.
It really makes you think about how much those perceptions still influence us today. It's easy to forget that this trial wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a media spectacle, captivating the nation.
Oh, absolutely. It's a pivotal moment in journalism. The Pittman brothers, with their stenography method, were able to capture every word of the trial, making it accessible to a much wider audience.
That's incredible. It must have been groundbreaking for its time.
It was. People across the country were devouring the daily news reports, experiencing the trial's twists and turns in real time.
And it sounds like it was a combination of the JFK assassination and the O.J. Simpson trial in terms of public fascination.
You got it. A true spectacle unfolding before a nation on edge, desperate for answers.
But as we know, public opinion of Mary Surratt shifted dramatically after her death, especially with her son's later trial. What happened? Was it simply a matter of the nation moving on, or was there more to it?
It's definitely more nuanced than that. There were a lot of factors at play.
Yeah.
There was a growing sense of fatigue with the assassination, a longing for healing. People were ready to move on.
So maybe they just wanted to forget the whole thing ever happened.
To an extent, yes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, Mary Surratt's supporters weren't going to let her memory fade quietly.
What were they doing?
They actively worked to reshape her image. They started portraying her as an innocent victim.
Like they were trying to rewrite history.
Exactly. And it wasn't just her supporters. There was this whole lost cause mythology emerging.
Right, the idea that the Confederacy was this noble but doomed effort.
Exactly. And in this new narrative, Mary Surratt became a symbol of the South's suffering and the North's supposed tyranny.
So she went from conspirator to martyr in the eyes of some.
You got it. Which makes it even more puzzling that Surrattsville, the town named after her family, decided to change its name to Clinton.
Yeah, you'd think they'd want to hold on to that connection if she was becoming this revered figure.
Right. But local historians say the residents actually did believe she was guilty. They weren't trying to erase her completely, just distance themselves from the controversy.
So maybe a fresh start for the town. A way to move on from the shadow of such a divisive event.
That's likely a big part of it. But, it's easy to get caught up in the legal and historical debates. But I keep thinking about the human element. What was Mary Surratt's life actually like? What kind of person was she, beyond the accusations and the veil?
Right, beyond the trial and the controversy, there was a real woman there.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that. We need to see her as a human being with her own hopes, fears, and motivations, not just a historical figure, especially considering the circumstances she was thrown into.
A widow struggling to support her family in the midst of a war.
Right. And a devout Catholic, deeply rooted in her faith. These aspects of her life must have influenced her choices, even the ones that now seem questionable.
It's like those moments in the podcast episode where the listener, a former resident of her boarding house, tries to reconcile their memories of Mary Surratt with the public narrative being spun around her.
Exactly. It's that struggle between personal experience and collective memory that's at the heart of understanding history.
It's not just about dates and events, but how those events are filtered through individual lives and perspectives.
Absolutely. It's a constant process of reshaping and reinterpreting as new evidence comes to light and new voices are heard.
And that's why approaching history with a critical eye is so crucial. We have to be aware of our own biases and how they might be influencing our interpretations.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, shifting gears a bit, Kate Clifford Larson also consulted on the 2011 film The Conspirator.
Oh, yeah, the one that dramatizes Mary Surratt's trial. I'm curious, what did you think about the film? Did she feel it did the story justice?
She had mixed feelings. While she appreciated that it brought this lesser-known story to a wider audience, she felt it was too sympathetic to Mary Surratt.
Really? In what way?
Well, for one, it tried to cast doubt on her guilt. It even invented a mother-son dynamic between her and her attorney.
Oh, wow, really taking creative liberties there. So in a way, the film was trying to rewrite history.
It seems so.
Hmm.
And it highlights how even fictionalized accounts can shape public perception.
For sure. Okay, let's circle back to the debate about Mary Surratt's guilt. Why do you think some people still believe she was innocent? Is it just nostalgia for a simpler past, or are there valid reasons for doubt?
I think it's more complicated than that. Some might find it hard to believe that a seemingly devout woman could be involved in such a horrific act. It challenges their worldview.
We like to put people in neat boxes, good or bad.
Right. But there are also legitimate concerns about the fairness of her trial. Remember, she was tried by a military tribunal, not a civilian court.
And some argue that she was denied due process.
Exactly. It wasn't a simple case of guilty or innocent.
Mm.
There were legitimate legal questions, which adds another layer of complexity.
And that's why it's so important to examine the evidence critically, consider different perspectives, and acknowledge that our understanding might be flawed.
Absolutely. There might not be a definitive answer, and that's okay. Okay, last big question. Why does Mary Surratt's story still matter today after all this time?
Yeah, why should we care about a woman who died over 150 years ago?
Because it forces us to grapple with issues that are still relevant today. The use of military tribunals, the influence of public opinion on trials, and the difficulty of ensuring fairness when emotions run high.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about the past. It shapes our present and future.
Exactly. And beyond the legal aspects, Mary Surratt's story challenges us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
Like what?
It challenges the notion that women are inherently incapable of violence or complicity in acts of terror. It dismantles those gender stereotypes.
We still struggle with those same biases today, even if we don't realize it.
It's not just about gender either. It's about the human capacity for both good and evil, the choices we make, and the impact they have.
It's like that saying, the past is never dead. It's not even past. Mary Surratt's story shows how history continues to influence our world.
You nailed it. What surprised you the most about this story?
Honestly, I was struck by how much agency Mary Surratt actually had. She wasn't just a passive bystander. She made choices, regardless of whether they were right or wrong, that had significant consequences.
Yes, it forces us to rethink traditional narratives about women in history. They weren't just sitting on the sidelines.
Right. They were active participants, shaping events in ways we often overlook.
Exactly. And that's what makes history so fascinating. It's about uncovering those untold stories and challenging our assumptions.
You know, it's amazing how, even after all these years, Mary Surratt's story can still spark so much debate and make us rethink things we thought we knew about the past.
It's like a historical puzzle that refuses to be solved.
Definitely. And there's no simple answer, no single piece of evidence that puts the whole thing to rest.
You've got some really respected historians like Kate Clifford Larson, who are convinced that Mary Surratt was guilty based on all their research.
But then you have others who just as strongly believe that she was innocent, pointing to things that don't quite add up in the trial records or questioning if the witnesses were really reliable.
It's almost like everyone's looking at the same evidence but seeing something different, you know?
Yeah.
Like their own beliefs and assumptions are kind of coloring their interpretation.
Yeah, it's like a Rorschach test of history.
That's a great analogy, and that's why approaching history with a critical eye is so important.
Yeah.
We've got to be aware of our own biases, those preconceived notions we all have, and how they might be influencing the way we understand the past.
It's a good reminder that we shouldn't just look for evidence that supports what we already believe.
Exactly. We got to be open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
Makes sense. So if someone's just starting to learn about Mary Surratt, where should they begin? How do you unravel a mystery like this?
I always tell people to start with the primary sources, the raw materials of history.
What do you mean by primary sources?
Things like the trial transcripts, interrogation records, letters, diaries from people who knew her, all those firsthand accounts.
So basically immerse yourself in the world of that time period.
Right. But don't just read passively, question things. Pay attention to the little details, the things that don't add up, the gaps in the story.
So be like a historical detective.
That's the idea. Gather your clues and form your own conclusions.
And just like a good detective, you have to be objective.
For sure. Thorough and willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it ends up challenging your initial thoughts.
Sometimes those discoveries can be kind of uncomfortable. Like when we have to confront parts of history that we might prefer to ignore.
Yeah, like the fact that women in the 19th century weren't immune to the desire for power or ambition.
And their actions could have big consequences, good and bad.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't a simple morality tale where everyone fits neatly into good or bad categories. It's messy and complicated, just like real life.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life and legacy of Mary Surratt, it's clear that her story is far from over.
I think she would be surprised by how much we're still talking about her.
It's been over 150 years since she was executed, and yet her case still fascinates us, sparks debate, and makes us question so much of what we thought we knew. It's like her presence is still felt in the corridors of history, pushing us to keep digging for the truth.
I think what makes it so enduring is that there's no easy resolution. There are still unanswered questions, and people love a good mystery, especially one that forces us to grapple with tough issues like guilt, innocence, and how women have shaped history.
And that's why Mary Surratt's story is still so relevant today. It's a reminder that history is alive. It's a conversation that's still happening, shaping our understanding of who we are and where we come from.
So as we conclude our deep dive, we encourage you to keep the conversation going.
Dive into those primary sources, listen to different viewpoints, and come to your own conclusions about this enigmatic woman.
See what you uncover. Maybe you'll find something that totally changes your perspective.
And as you think about the evidence and the arguments on both sides, consider this. What would Mary Surratt say if she could speak to us today? What story would she tell? What truths would she reveal?
That's a question that's definitely worth pondering as we try to understand her complex and really fascinating story.
And on that note, thanks for joining us on this journey into the captivating world of Mary Surratt.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep that historical conversation going.